Jeff Gibbons here with another video, and in this one I'm going to be going over Arturia's newest instrument, the OBXAV. This one is released today and I got to have a little sneak peek at it. So what I've done is I've got a few demo songs to show you, and then we're going to take a deep dive into the software so that you don't have to read the manual. Now, this instrument came out in 1980 and was the follow-up to the OBX, which came out the year before, and it had a few things that were different, and Arturia has graciously placed both of those sort of functionalities into this one virtual instrument. And since it was released in the 80s, I've got a few of my favorite 80s antiques here in the studio, including the Radio Shack Armatron, Optimus Prime, even the Tomy Crackbot. That's what they called it. Let's check out the OBXAV. So first things first, of course, you've got to check out the jump patch, because legend has it that the OBXA was the actual synth that was used on Van Halen's Jump. So here's the patch itself. Pretty faithful recreation, and that's just a patch that comes with it. And I've got that patch in here. I've also got a bass synth. Let's see what we've got there. So a nice arpeggiated bass patch, which we'll talk about later. I've got a real portamento kind of patch here. Which of course I set the portamento to be quite long so that we slide from one note to the other. So that's this control right here. And then I've got a sequenced patch, which is called Emo Wave. Love it. Let's have a listen to that patch. Very cool, and we'll discover how these kind of patches are created with modulation. So we can see this modulation right here is modulating the frequency or the pitch of oscillator 1. So we'll be able to see how we can make our own little sequenced patches like that. Let's have a listen to it. Got a bit of some Back to the Future vibes, maybe a little bit of Huey Lewis, even rocking the Marty McFly calculator watch. So that's the jump little idea. We got some fun patches in there. I've also got a kit that's just a loop, an 80s loop. Let's go look at a few other ideas. This one started with a patch called Around Midnight. So let's have a listen to that. So a nice sequenced patch in there. Then I've got a bass in here. This is the hippogriff patch. They've got eclectic keys. Beautiful lead type plucky sound. And then we've got a Jean-Michel Jarre-esque kind of arpeggiated patcher that I just played in. And sometimes I like using arpeggiators, sometimes I like just having control over the notes, but I do find with the arpeggiator it does things that I wouldn't normally do. But let's have a listen to this little idea. There we go. So that one also has a loop, one of the old BT loops that I've got from a long time ago, one of my favorite electronic artists. Doesn't take long for me to come up with these ideas because the patches are actually pretty inspiring. I've never played the original, so that's the problem here is I kind of tried calling around to see if anybody had one, but they're pretty hard to come by, and that's obviously why this software is so exciting. So for this little idea, I started with this pad. Very Boards of Canada-esque, and then I got myself a bass line that kind of tried to get influence from my favorite Jean-Michel Jarre. I listen to his records all the time. My kids have his tunes memorized, which is saying something. I love the things he does with his bass instruments. Like, it's not predictable. So I kind of went for something with that one. That is the Deep Organic Mood bass patch. Really nice. This one here, by the way, was called Knight and Apprentice. And then we've got the Above the Clouds pad, or Above Clouds. And then we've got an arpeggiated patch. And then the last one I've got is a lead sound. Okay, so that's probably enough for little sample ideas of me using this virtual instrument. So now let's get into the instrument itself. Let's have a look at what makes it tick and some of the things that aren't really obvious right on the surface when you open it up. So I'm going to make a new patch here, and I'm using Cubase. Of course, this will work in pretty much any other DAW. I have other videos on the whole of V collection and another video on pigments, and you'll notice that with Arturia software, we've got a lot of similarities between the different synthesizers. So once you get to know their sort of ecosystem, it all becomes easy to jump from one synth to another. So this, of course, looks just like the real thing. As I was saying before, we've got deeper features which we can access by these little arrows right here. Modulation, effects, and then a modulation matrix. So let's pop this up for now and just talk about the main page. Up on the top left-hand corner is where you're going to find a few things like importing presets, saving your own presets, making new presets. And if you want to start from an initialized patch, you just hit the new preset right there. And we can resize the window, so I can make it 140%, but I think I will leave it at 120 for now. And then next we've got some tutorials, and then we've got the manual and the FAQ right there as well. This little button right here is where you're going to find the browser. And they have a great browser in their virtual instruments. You can type in metadata, you can thin it out by just looking for pads that are bright, and you'll only see patches that are bright pads over on the right or the middle section here. So we can also browse presets on this device with the Microlab. So I've got the Microlab hooked up right here. I can just press Shift, Next, and Previous to go from one patch to another as I'm playing. You can also just use the down and up arrows. So it depends if you're just playing at the keyboard or if you're typing at your keyboard. Easy ways to go through different patches. We've got your own user bank of patches that you can create. And anytime you want to change a patch, so say you load something up, you make some changes to it, you can then resave that as a new patch in your own folder. And then of course you can give it new metadata and stuff like that. And so the browser is very full-featured and very easy to use. And then over on the right-hand side, we can see some other information about the presets, and of course the little heart to favorite any of your favorite presets. So let's go back over to the main page now, and you can also access all of the patches right here. And then over on the far right, we've got the extended features, and then we've got some MIDI control features right here. Looking at the main page, we've got master volume over on the left-hand side, hold, which will just hold notes forever. And then we've got a chord feature, this one already has a chord on it. So if I click on this little chord button right here and then hit the select button, we can see which notes are being played every time I play a note. So we've got a major 7 chord here. I can make this a little funkier if I want. Now we've got a major 7 with a sharp 4 in there. That's kind of fun. Let's make this a little more complex. We'll make it a 9 chord. So with the chord button here, you get to choose a chord that happens every time you play a note. Now, that's not going to be ideal if you don't always want, a major 7 chord on every note that you play. So that's something to be aware of. You could get around that by choosing just simple things like a root and the 5th. We've got the master tune, which we can adjust the overall frequency of the entire patch with both oscillators. Okay, so before we get into the voices section of the synthesizer, one thing that needs to be noted is down below is where you choose how many voices are being used for your patch. So if we want a monophonic patch, we set it to 1. And now we've got a classic monophonic synth. And if we want up to 16 voices now. And then the other thing you need to know is that with the OBXA, there's 16 voices of polyphony. Next, we've got the voices section. So detuning will detune some of the voices in with our unison sort of effect here. And then if you have pan set, you can choose where these voices are going. So you can see 8 knobs right here, and I can have them kind of spread out, the voices spread out over the spectrum. So now we're choosing the stereo spread on our own with this little pan setting. And so if we have this stereo button pressed, we see some other controls that pop up down here for that. And with that, we can do things like play with the LFO, and it will mess with the phase of the LFO on the copies of the new voices. And the oscillator will add variation to the tuning of the different sides. The filter will change the filter on the left and right side if you crank this up. And then we have the amount and rate for the rate of panning that's happening back and forth. So we can hear it as it's sort of oscillating back and forth. So there's some detailed stuff that you can do with the unison setting on this synthesizer. Next, we've got the modulation section. In the next portions of the synthesizer, I'm going to point you to a video I've got on synthesis where I talk about LFOs, oscillators, filters, envelopes, and I'm not going to go into too much detail in this video because I've got a whole video just about that kind of stuff. So if you're new to what an LFO is or an oscillator, make sure you click that link and go watch that video, then come back here and finish watching this video. So as I said in that video, we've got LFO is a low frequency oscillator, is just a way to have some parameter on your synthesizer change over time, and you get to control how quick that change happens, what it's controlling, and how the change happens. So let's just look at it. What we've got here is we've got the sync button, which sets the LFO to the tempo of your host DAW tempo. So we're at 120 beats per minute right now. So if I turn this on, we can choose bars, we can choose 16ths of a bar or a 16th note. We can also choose the way the change happens. So a sine wave would be a smooth change like this. A square wave would be up, down, up, down. So let's set this LFO right now with this modulation control right here. So I'm going to have it set to oscillator 1 frequency. So right now, if I had turned this off, we don't hear any change. If I turn this on, we can hear a sine wave that's modulating the pitch of our oscillator, which is creating the tone. So if I set the sync to, let's say, 16th of a bar or 16th note, really fast. If I set it to a half note, we can hear it's a lot slower, but it's all syncing to the tempo of the project. If I click on the wave, we can change the waveform. So it could be a triangle, which sounds very similar to a sine. This one's saw, just starts over again. We've got a couple others in there. We've got sample and hold smooth. So let's go try this on a sine wave. And I'm going to set this key trig button, and what that's going to do is it's going to reset the LFO every time you click on the key. So if with it turned off, we can hear it cycling through whether I'm holding the note down or not. It's just going to keep cycling through that change or that oscillation. With the key trig on, it's going to restart the LFO every time I play a note. So that's what that little key trig button means. Sometimes you want it on, sometimes you want it off. Next, we've got what we are modulating. So right now I'm modulating the frequency of oscillator 1. Let's turn that off. And with oscillator 2 frequency, of course, if I had something going on right there, I would have to probably just turn on the oscillator to hear that. So let's just turn on oscillator 2. If I go over to this filter control, you'll see I've got oscillator 1 and 2. I can turn that all the way up. Now we've got both oscillators are creating tones at the same time. And I've got my oscillator 2 is being modulated by the LFO, while the oscillator 1 isn't. So if I set them both there, sounds pretty bad with just one going, but hey, maybe sometime that would be cool. Next I could go and change the filter. So I turn that one on. And it's changing the filter frequency. It's basically like taking this knob and just going over and over again. That's what an LFO does. And we can choose to go, a square wave would go like this, like that, back and forth. So hopefully that makes sense what an LFO is doing. My students often think it's some kind of pitch or some kind of tone, but it's not, it's just a control. So if we set it to the filter frequency, crank up the depth. That's how to use the LFO. We've got a couple other things we can do. We can control pulse width modulation if we have a square wave. So that only works if you have a square wave, which we do right there. And pulse width modulation just changes the top part of the square. So is it going to be a perfect up and down, or is the up phase going to be longer than the down phase or shorter than the down phase? And then also control volume, which is going to give you like a tremolo effect. That's our LFO section under this modulation heading. Let's just turn the depth of both of those off for now. So we're back to just a regular tone, and we can see what we're generating right now. If I crank up oscillator 1, turn down oscillator 2. So when it comes to the oscillators, there is a funny little thing that you have to know about this specific synthesizer. And I'm guessing this goes back to the original. And the way you choose your waveforms is, this is a sawtooth wave, nothing is a triangle, and then this one is a square wave, and then this is both at the same time. Then we also have a second oscillator right here, and the only way you're going to hear that is if the oscillator 2 volume control is up by some amount. So now we can do things like change the tuning of the second oscillator, and anytime you want to reset a parameter in these synthesizers, just double click and that will reset it back to 0. We can also use the sync button to get hard sync between these two oscillators. And now you hear changing the frequency changes the overtones of this note instead of actually just changing the note of the second oscillator. So that's a hard sync button that's common on a lot of synthesizers. We can play with cross modulation with this control, and then we can change pulse width with this one if we are on squares. Let's turn oscillator 2 off for a second. So we can just play with pulse width of our square wave single oscillator, or if we have two oscillators on, it's going to affect things differently there as well. So those are just some controls for the oscillator. Next we've got the filter. We've got the filter frequency, which controls the point at which frequencies are being cut out of your synth sound. And then resonance, which causes a little bump at the cutoff point. So if this is your filter, and it's dropping all the frequencies out past this point right here, if you crank up the resonance, it's going to cause a little boost right before the drop off, and that's what that control is doing right there. This little mod control right here is going to control how much of this filter envelope is applied to your filter. So again, check my old video for envelopes. They're a kind of confusing thing. But right now, if I set my filter something like this, and we can change the aggressiveness of the filter with this 4-pole button. And we can also use this keyboard tracking button right here to control, does the filter kind of open up as you move up the keyboard? So that's what the tracking control is for. And so let's look at this mod button right here. Now we can set an envelope that causes the filter to open up or close down quickly or take a long time. This is how we change the envelopes in here. And let's crank up this to get even more aggressive. So now with this loudness envelope, what I can do is I can choose, does the note come in really quickly? And does the note get up to a loud point at first and then sustain at a lower level? And how long does it take to get to that lower level? So this sustain level. Right now it's at its highest point, so if I bring it down, you can hear it going in, dropping down to a level, sustaining, and then when I release the note, the release control determines how fast the note fades out. So you can hear the sustain level is, let's go really low with the sustain level. Really low. And then the release, how quickly does the note release once you release the key? So those are our different envelopes. And then of course, if I do this with the filter, let's crank that up. You hear the release is really fast on the filter, so it's kind of shutting off, even though my note is releasing long. So I can crank up the release on my filter. Now the filter is closing off slower. So those are our filter controls. So next we've got our arpeggiator, and if I click this little button right here, of course the arpeggiator turns on. And let's crank this rate up. We've got it set to sync, so let's go to 16th notes. And then we can choose how the arpeggiator is played. Is it kind of cycling through the notes as you play them? So this note would be first, that note second, that note's third, and so on. Is it cycling through the notes in the chord just straight up, straight down, or up and down, or random? And then we can choose how many octaves that's going over. So we could say up and down 2 octaves, or 3 octaves. Fairly self-explanatory. We've got portamento, which is the time between notes. And if we quantize that, it's going to quantize in semitones. So here it's cycling through the notes as it's going from one note to the next. Let's crank that back down. And then we've got vibrato right here, which is going to control the pitch of our oscillators. So let's just set it to oscillator 1 right now and play with that a little bit. So we'll change the depth. And then we've got pitch bend controls down here at the bottom left corner. Now let's get into the detailed settings of the synthesizer so we can just quickly go over that. So we've got modulations up in the top left corner, and then we've got effects. I think effects are fairly self-explanatory. Let's turn off our vibrato. So we can turn on reverb right here. And we have 3 different effects we can choose. I can choose a drop-down menu for the other different types of effects: delay, chorus, flanger, phaser, etc., and as well as a much more complicated filter, other than this filter that we've got right here. So we can turn on delay. We can have it ping pong side to side. I love that. We can choose to filter out some of the frequencies on the delayed notes themselves, or we can just have them go straight full volume. We've got sync, so we can sync it to the tempo of our project. And then we can click this little binary button right here if we want to go to a dotted rhythm. Now that's a really important one because I do love the dotted rhythm on my delays. That's a classic U2 thing. So you can choose a dotted delay right there. It's a different way of doing it than other effects. We've got the reverb, obvious reverb parameters, and then the other effects as well. Let's have a look at the filter. And with the multi-mode filter, we can choose different types of filters: high pass, band pass, and then we've got comb filters as well. So those are some of the more complex things you can choose for filtering on this synthesizer. And then we've got this little button which controls whether the effects go from one to the other, so they're in series, or whether they go in parallel. So in other words, right now you're getting reverb on, then you're getting delay on it. So the delayed effects are also going to have reverb on it, but if you don't want that, you could have them go in parallel. So that's how you mess around with effects on this thing. Let's go look back at the modulations, which is one of the more complicated things on this synthesizer. And the way the modulations work isn't actually that complicated. So what we've got here is 4 different modulations we can have on any one of our synthesizer patches. And I can click from this little drop-down menu to choose something. So let's go with something a little bit more obvious, like master tune. So if I choose master tune, and then I choose the percent right here. So let's crank this up to 100%. So now we can see every time I play a note, it's going through this cycle, but it just keeps going. If I turn key trig off, it's not going to reset this modulation every time I play the key. It's actually just going to cycle through this. But if I have key trig on, it's going to restart every time I play a note. We've got these little controls right here, which will allow you to make something be a hard control. It'll allow you to have a curved slope, a logarithmic slope, or it'll be a linear slope, just like this one right here. So I can push up or down for those kind of changes. So this is where you could get some really fun pitch changes. Let's set another point right there just by clicking. And by the way, double clicking resets it. And then let's go like this. Let's put another point right here. And then we'll make this one. And let's set that one to be a hard one as well. And then set this hard like that. Let's do it to -1. So now I've got a fun little pitch thing that's going on, and it's set to a bar. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1. So you can see how it's changing the pitch according to time. And then I can also change this to be 2 bars long. And I could also go in and choose presets that they've got in here. So I could choose a sine wave. I could choose some more funky ones. And it's very easy to go in and tweak these so that you can choose a different angle. That sounds pretty neat. Let's take this one and Crank that up. Take that one down. So you see how easy it is to go in and make your own custom modulations with this whole modulation section on the synthesizer. Very powerful. You can have it restart, you can have it loop over, or just happen once. And then over on the right hand side, I can go velocity. I want you to control some parameter. I want you to control the filter frequency. So the harder I press, the more the filter frequency is going to open up. So let's crank up the filter. So now what's happening is if I play softly and play hard, the filter opens up. So that's controlled with velocity. I could also have this change with the key as I move up and down the keyboard. I could have this change with aftertouch. That might be a fun one. Let's reset that and crank up aftertouch. So if your keyboard has aftertouch, now of course you can get very expressive with this synthesizer. We've got modulation wheel, and then we've also got a filter envelope control as well. So that's what this modulation matrix controls. It's actually quite easy to understand. It looks a little intimidating at first, but it's actually quite simple. So hopefully that gives you a good overview of the synthesizer and the controls on it. I really love all of Arturia's products. Their synthesizers just sound so great, and having this one in the collection is fantastic. I don't know if I'll ever own an OBXA myself, but I'm just going to keep checking Craigslist to see if one day I could get one. But for now, this will more than suffice and give me that great 80s sound in any songs I'm working on. So hit the subscribe button, go check out my back catalog of videos, and stay tuned for more of these types of videos in the future. Thanks for watching.